CIA at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Bellingham founded the MIT AAV Lab, co-founded Bluefin Robotics, and was the founding director of the Center of Marine Robotics at Woods Hole. He developed a number of autonomous underwater vehicles, leading field programs with those vehicles from the Antarctic to Arctic. His interests currently revolve around assuring autonomous systems, particularly multi-platform robotic systems operating in poorly understood environments. Before this workshop, we'll have Dr. Broughel speak first about her content, and then Dr. Bellingham, and then a joint Q&A session where you guys can ask questions. Yeah, now we have the floor to you, Dr. Broughel.
Thank you. Just a quick sound check. I can see you. Hi. Today we will talk about data centers' appetite for clean, firm power. It would have been very useful for me to ask questions from you, but I can see you, so maybe you can vote with your hands.
Recording in progress.
Okay, we're recording this. Who knows which country has the largest number of nuclear reactors in service right now? All right, I see a hand.
Is it China?
China, it's a good guess. Any other guesses? Yeah, I see another hand.
USA? Oh,
Russia is a good guess. Russia wants to build a lot more, as does India. So it's the USA. I've heard the correct answer already. So we are sitting on top of the largest nuclear fleet in the world. So the US, and I can start sharing my slides. Let me show you what I wanted to share. You can see my slides, but not my notes. Is that right? I just want to make sure. Just the slides, not the notes, right?
You can see your
you
notes.
can see both.
All right, I don't want both. It's going to distract you. Let me try again. Slideshow. Yeah, that is probably better. So you can see that we are indeed sitting on top of very advanced nuclear economy. And you might have seen a lot of announcements recently coming from a variety of AI companies and just big tech companies in general. So we are observing that Microsoft and Amazon and Alphabet, the parent company of Google, have all invested or announced collaborations with nuclear. So what kind of bromance is going on here? I'm going to explain why nuclear or geothermal, so basically clean, firm power, is a perfect match for data centers. And that data centers are going to be a very significant load in the next 10 years. So we're not talking until 2050. We are talking the next 10 years. So at the moment, data centers use about 4.5% of electricity in this country. By 2030, so in the short 5 years or so, we will have 9%. So it's going to double in capacity. And by 2035, we're going to witness 22% of load, electric load, to data centers. There's only one sector that will have a higher load than data centers. Do you want to make an educated guess what that's going to be? Does anybody own an electric vehicle or drives one? Yeah, so transportation is going to be 46% of load. So while we're talking about energy transition, it's actually in a way a misnomer, because we are decarbonizing, but we're also quickly adding load. And in the past decade, American utilities did not have to build out capacity and transmission distribution to the same speed. So Microsofts of the world cannot afford not operating. They need to be able to have firm capacity that is available to them 24/7. And this is this magical, this is the magic that nuclear power is able to afford. 24/7 predictable power. And um, also wanted to mention that it takes 1 to 5 gigawatts to train one LLM, so large language model. Does anybody know how large one nuclear power plant is on average? It's very simple math. So AP 1000 is, so um, now the typical nuclear reactor that has been installed in the US is about 1 gigawatt. So it's very simple math. You need 1 to 5 nuclear power plants to train one language model, LLM. Okay, so the size just blows your mind. The largest wind turbine in operation is 15 or 16 megawatts. Okay, so gigawatts is 1,000 times more than megawatts. So you understand that just the sheer scale of the problem. I wanted to draw your attention to the difference between basically like nuclear landscape and why these recent announcements are so interesting. So the US nuclear industry hasn't been building for the last 30 years. So we had the whole gap of not having nuclear engineers who have actually built a plant. The whole focus was on running these nuclear facilities as safely as possible and as cheaply as possible. So what do we have here? We have a couple of projects that were completed just these in the past year or two, and both of them are in Broughel in Georgia, Broughel. The issue is that the first reactor was a 200% cost overrun. And this sounds awful, doesn't it? It's like when you want to build something, you want to understand how much this is going to cost. But I will try to argue that this is a bug, it's not a feature. Sometimes you hear that nuclear is so expensive. Microsoft would not be investing into nuclear if it wasn't so expensive. It has the qualities that are very sought after by these technology companies. So I'll show you Lazard LCOE valuations in nuclears. Old existing nuclear plants are one of the cheapest sources of electricity. The issue with Broughel is that we have started building one-of-a-kind things, and every time you build a one-of-a-kind project, especially of this size, it's really, really expensive to permit the first thing. So the first nuclear reactor in over 30 years was a very expensive undertaking. So it's 6 years late, double the time, cost overrun. Then they did the next unit, and that went much, much faster. So the nuclear industry now is exploring several avenues. They're saying that we will just keep building the same kind of reactor because it will not cost us to build one-of-a-kind reactor as much as every next reactor of that same kind. Another option for the nuclear industry is to reopen old plants. And this is exactly what's going on with Microsoft. I'm sure everybody has heard the 3 Mile Island accident. So one reactor is shut down. This is the one that had an accident. The other one is going to be reopened to power Microsoft data center. This is just an incredible comeback. There is another reactor in Palisades in Michigan, I believe. It's also reopening. So we're bringing back old, safe nuclear fleet. Microsoft's and Amazon's and Google's are also investing into SMRs. This is a new kind of technology. This is a small modular reactor, not to the same 1 gigawatt size, but this is might be using more novel technologies as well. So it's smaller, and because the reactors we have right now are pretty old. Nuclear reactor gets several permits. The first initial permit to operate is 40 years. You can get another extension by 20 years. So the reactor can operate 60 years safely, and then they can get a third extension to say 80 years. That's a long time. And obviously technology has moved forward. And at the same time, once we build it, it's really, really cheap to operate. I want to do a quick time check. I think I'm still good, but moderators, please jump in when it's time. So in the media, you often see this claim that there are cost and time overruns of nuclear. It's partially because we haven't built in a long time. We have, quote unquote, forgotten how to permit it, how to build it. Broughel reactor, when the cost was cost estimate was done, it wasn't done on the completed design. And it's a bad idea to do permitting and costing of a reactor where we haven't completed the design. So again, I will repeat this: high cost and time overruns for nuclear is a bug. It's not a feature. There's nothing inherently wrong with nuclear. It's just the way we are building it. And what I think is going to happen right now is that the tech bros are going to throw all the money and the know-how and good amount of journalistic attention to make sure that their nuclear projects are going to be a success. So it'll be a very interesting space to watch. Now about money. You cannot build anything if you cannot raise funds. And nuclear used to be a dirty word. Like banks would not touch nuclear. It is impossible for developing nation to finance nuclear through multilateral institutions. So what do developing nations do? Well, they cite coal a lot of the time. So you have to think about what is the next best thing that they will be able to get technology and access to, or they partner with our friends China and Russia to build nuclear, to help build nuclear. But this is for developing countries. For there was this very recent announcement that is incredible, because a bunch of very large financial institutions said that they will start funding nuclear. Because as you can imagine, it's extremely expensive to fund it. And also LPO, Loan Program Office at the US DOE, is making sure that interest rates for such loans are fairly low, because of the amount of billions of dollars you need to invest into this. You need to make sure you have low interest rates. Otherwise, it will be impossible to build it. Now, here is one of my final slides. You will see, so this 31, this is the LCOE, levelized cost of electricity evaluation. So you'll see that nuclear is $31. This diamond means this is for fully depreciated nuclear fleet. The number 141 to 221, it's in gray, because we're not sure, because we haven't built a nuclear reactor in this country for such a long time. We don't have a reasonable cost estimate. If we start building again, more than 2 reactors or 3 reactors in 30 years, these data will be much more reliable. But you can see why Microsofts of the world are investing into nuclear. It is by far the cheapest option. It's clean, as it doesn't emit greenhouse gases during operation, and it doesn't suffer from intermittency, because like I come from the solar and wind world. This is what I've been doing for the last 15 years of my career. So you would look at this graph and would think, okay, why are we then not powering our data centers with solar and wind? That would be lovely. That would be also very low greenhouse gas emission option, but it's intermittent. So you have to, on top of this, add a giant battery. And there are so many risks associated with intermittency that data centers just simply cannot afford it. Data centers are looking for this reliability, and among the new technologies, data centers are now interested in new generation geothermal, so advanced geothermal. And you might be thinking all about spent fuel. There is an interesting, so in the US, all the spent fuel is at the reactor site. We haven't figured out where to store spent fuel in this country. You might have heard about Yucca Mountain project. It failed because of inability to permit it and the pushback of local populations and the state that did not want nuclear spent fuel depository in their state and their holy sites. So, but it doesn't have to be this way. There are other countries in the world, such as Finland and Sweden, who have this like figured out. So it took about 20 years for Finnish to build their first permanent nuclear waste repository. It cost them about 1 billion, and it's going to hold about 5 tons of waste. It will be very safe. There are 3 layers of protection. So there's this. There will be a copper canister, and then it's wrapped in the bentonite clay because it's water absorbing. And then you bury the canister deep underground, and it stays there for billions of years. Because this spots in Finland and Sweden is also permitting one. It hasn't moved since Earth pretty much was formed. So for billions of years, this has been a stable formation. There are more formations like that in the world. And now I'm going to say something really controversial, is that nuclear waste storage is not a very urgent problem. Like climate change is an urgent problem. We should have solved climate change like yesterday. We're going to blow through our carbon budget this decade. So I will argue that if we want to have an advanced economy with data centers, we want to have decarbonized economy that can carry all of the EV loads that are going to be coming online. I'm an EV driver myself. We can wait with figuring out what to do with nuclear waste. We have about 100 years. So it's safe right now in different storage facilities around the world. You could be in the storage pond. You can see a picture. It's from the UK. You can vitrify it and then store it. It's not like this problem can wait. And I like the idea of attacking problems one at a time. And to me, climate change and the quality of life of us and our children, which should be first decarbonized and second digitalized. These are the big 2 trends. It's possible with firm, clean baseload power, and we have very few options for that. And nuclear is one of them. And it would be foolish to not consider this. And even the US DOE agrees. The US DOE at the moment is working on tripling nuclear capacity. So as I mentioned, we have about 95 gigawatts, so close to 100 gigawatts of nuclear capacity online. We need to triple it by 2050. So we need to be building 13 gigawatts, or the equivalence of 13 1 gigawatt nuclear facilities, nuclear reactors each year to get where we need to be. And with that, I'm going to ping pong this over to Jim.
Wow, that was interesting. I should at some point I should talk to you about this group that is interested in putting nuclear on shipping. So it's a separate, it's a interesting conversation with them. So I am going to let me share screen here. Go and. Okay, so hopefully you just see my slides. great. And you obviously can hear me. So I'm going to talk about sort of the flip side. So I think Anna talked about some of the really kind of climate costs associated with AI, the largest of which are associated with the large language models. But in general, the increasing computational infrastructure that we need to support AI and all of our digital age are driving a lot of potential carbon emissions, unless of course we manage to power those with nuclear. So, but there are some pluses associated with AI, and so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. And I just want to highlight that this particular set of slides that I'm using is from a presentation I gave together with Elizabeth Riley, who's a colleague of mine at the Applied Physics Lab. I have an appointment over there. And so Elizabeth and I gave a talk at South by Southwest a little bit ago. So credit where credit's due. Elizabeth provided a lot of the APL material in here. So the basic story here is that we know that AI is showing up pretty much everywhere. It's showing up on the roads in the form of increasingly sophisticated cars. It's definitely showing up in the way of AI assistance, and it's showing up in infrastructure and, for that matter, in the defense world. And of course, if you ask AI, how it helps with climate change, it gives you a very poetic and positive view of that. So let's go through and talk about what that actually looks like. So right now, I think right now what we can talk about is a set of things which are associated with decarbonizing and therefore largely electrifying our energy infrastructure. And as you just heard in the previous talk, there's all sorts of issues associated with the fact that the infrastructure, particularly in the US, the power distribution infrastructure is pretty old. And so learning how to manage it, expand it, and use what we have more effectively, and how it changes as you move the power generation from the central sites to the edge. In the case of renewables, all revolve around some pretty sophisticated challenges associating the energy grid. We also have these large cities, an enormous amount of infrastructure. You can build a building which uses an enormous amount of energy. You can build a building which actually is very energy efficient. There's a whole LEED certification process for that. And so there's an awful lot we can do to sort of minimize energy consumption and make ourselves more efficient. And then we also need to understand, in effect, what the overall carbon budget is. So what is actually being put into the atmosphere in the way of greenhouse gases? And by the way, one should include things like methane in that, because as you warm the planet, you begin to do things like melt permafrost, which releases methane actually in many parts of the world at high latitudes. And so as a consequence, you have a whole set of things you need to do associated with understanding, in effect, what managing, if you will, the overall carbon ecosystem that we are so significantly perturbing. And of course, it's just the beginning of it. So one of the other things that we really need to acknowledge is that as climate changes, and it's changing particularly rapidly at high latitudes, there's all kinds of other second order effects. We see more energetic storms. We see sea level rise. The sea level rise right now is not too dramatic, sort of 1.5 inches a decade. But as the large ice sheets, the large grounded ice sheets break up in Greenland and Antarctica, you could see conceivably much larger sea level rise. And there's a lot of implications for national security. So both in terms of what I guess my friends would call the soft path to security, how do you make your economy in effect more resilient to these challenges, as well as national security, which comes from increasing global stress on other countries in particular, leading to global tensions. So these are all things that we need to worry about. And so as a consequence, one of the big discussions really revolves around how climate change is connected to national security. So these are all very big topics, which of course you all are all on top of. I hope this movie is playing for you. This just kind of shows circulation in the oceans. One of the things that folks often don't realize is that a large part of the climate system is actually very poorly observed, and that's the ocean environment. So the ocean, in effect, is highly variable. It's the sink for most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere eventually, which has impacts on ecosystems in the ocean. Those ecosystems produce about half of the oxygen we breathe. And there's implications as well for heat transport. So the higher latitudes, particularly in the northern hemisphere, are warmer because the ocean transports heat from the equatorial regions to higher latitudes. So one of the things that is really critical to us is understanding this very poorly understood part of the Earth's climate system, and I include in that the high latitudes, or what we would call the cryosphere. So this is kind of the trajectory for the talk. Number one, understanding the problem. Number two, can we predict it? Prediction, of course, is key in terms of allowing us to understand the impacts, for example, of different policies. What is the impact, for example, of decarbonizing a little bit faster or a little bit slower? And then finally, what can we do? Are there radical transformations that we can make, perhaps, with AI as it becomes more prevalent, to our economy that might support a more stable climate world. So let's talk first about understanding the problem. And I think that most of us recognize that the greenhouse gas calculations are not really that complicated. As a matter of fact, they were really first done in the late 1800s. A set of calculations by Arrhenius, one of the great physicists, famous for his contributions to thermodynamics. And his calculations basically do a pretty good job of describing the global warming that we see today. Now, the thing is these calculations are kind of in aggregate. And as we talked about earlier, there's all kinds of other more detailed calculations, changes in precipitation, changes in storms, intensities, changes in vegetation, changes in the ocean ecosystem, which require a great deal more sophistication to predict. And so this really takes me back again to the ocean environment. So the ocean environment is this basic area of the world, 70% of the planet, the largest ecosystem by far. And as a consequence, we really spend very little, actually, resources, comparatively speaking, understanding that ocean environment. So the things that we really kind of need to know about the ocean revolve around this transport of heat. That transport of heat, we increasingly think, might not be as stable as we would have hoped, particularly in the Atlantic. There's something called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and there's been a number of papers recently which have talked about potential shutdown of that or partial shutdown of that in the next couple of decades, which is pretty shocking, really. So as a consequence, one of the things that you need, of course, if you're going to understand this environment better, is you actually need better observations. And this is the challenge with the ocean, right? It's impenetrable to radar, it's impenetrable to radio waves. And so as a consequence, the only way to make measurements in the interior are to introduce instruments. And so robotic systems are a big part of how we are increasingly mobilizing capability to do a better job of instrumenting the ocean. And AI is a really big part of this because these vehicles are out of communication. They need to be able to take care of themselves in that environment between times on the surface. And also, we need to understand how to deploy them. And the deployment strategies for these turn out to be fairly difficult and challenging problems, which are coupled greatly to our ability to model the ocean and the climate system. So the other aspect of this, of course, really revolves around understanding the emissions piece of this. So, you know, as we come up to the atmosphere, there's certain sources of carbon dioxide, which, you know, we can sort of see and track and calculate directly. There's other sources which are not as obvious. Including, for example, it's not at all clear how much methane, for example, is coming out of seafloor in the Arctic Ocean. It could be a large number, it could be a small number. It really depends on the dynamics of marine ecosystems, which, as I said, are very poorly understood. So this is kind of where the AI really begins to come in. There is a activity climate trace, which is a consortium, which is using basically a combination of machine learning and remote sensing and all sorts of private sources of data in order to understand where the carbon emissions, what the carbon point sources are, what the carbon emissions actually look like. And one of the things that you can do when you bring this sort of capability to bear is to begin to track that, what was it, 46% of carbon of energy usage that Anna just mentioned. You can begin to look at the roads and traffic on the roads and understand, in effect, carbon emissions directly from basically on a city and even a street level. So these are the types of things that you really need to have if you're going to make wise decisions about policy decisions about supporting climate. And this, by the way, the Applied Physics Lab is part of this consortium. So this city level data is shared through this climate trace website. It's freely available, so if you go there, you can take a look at it. These types of things are a little addictive. I'll warn you, you get on them, they're hard to get off. But it's a really interesting data set. So let's talk a little bit about where we're headed. So project, you know, what's the trajectory look like? And basically what you really would like to do is you'd like to have effectively a digital twin of the Earth. And we do that a lot. So we create climate models, and those climate models are basically digital twins. And one of the challenges that you have with predicting weather systems is that it's actually very tough. It's and weather systems, which are sort of a shorter time range prediction than a climate model. You know, we know when I was a kid and the weather predictions came on the television, we kind of didn't believe them. You know, sort of what the weather was today, you could tell by looking out your window what the weather was going to be like in a couple of days. Maybe the weatherman was right, maybe not. Today, weather predictions are astonishingly accurate. And one of the innovations that occurred was realizing ensemble prediction actually is very powerful. So it turns out that lots of so-so weather prediction systems run simultaneously are a lot more insightful and a lot better than one really good climate system. And so here's pictures of trajectories of hurricanes, and you can kind of see that they all pretty much overlay all of the different runs of this particular weather system overlay. It tells you that they're pretty good. And so these are the types of things that we increasingly need to do with climate, because each climate model has its own set of approximations associated with it. And so as a consequence, what you really want to understand is what effect those approximations has on the overall prediction system. So I mentioned this Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And so this is kind of a picture of the red is kind of movement of heat largely on the surface of the ocean. And that surface water sinks at high latitudes and returns to usually the equatorial regions, largely via these deep undercurrents. And so there's a large amount of overturning which occurs in the North Atlantic and the Labrador Sea and the Greenland Sea. And one of the big questions really revolves around how stable is this, because this moves a lot of heat up to the North Atlantic, and as a consequence, Europe is about 5 degrees warmer than it would be otherwise because of this. And so understanding and modeling these types of effects of climate, at a fairly detailed level have enormous impacts on, for example, understanding what might occur to agriculture and our ability to feed the world. As you suddenly see, for example, ironically, global warming perhaps triggering enormous cooling in some parts of the world as well. And of course, one of the challenges of this is that the action here is that where the sinking occurs, it occurs during winter, it occurs in extreme weather events. I spent some time up in the North Atlantic. It's a very challenging environment to work in, and it's a kind of place where you really want to use robots rather than ships. Right now, we have very limited coverage of the world's ocean by ships. So I think that, this is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, is a good example of what climate scientists fear, which are tipping points. They're points where you push the climate system, and then it flips into a new state. And so one of the big questions, and one of the things that people are using AI for, is to actually study those, both identify those tipping points, and also begin to study what might be an indicator that we're approaching a tipping point. So these are obviously critical things for us to understand in terms of an observing system. And so finally, the last couple of points here I just want to talk about really revolve around what do you do with all this information? How can you respond to it? And we all know that this is one of the central problems of the day. And the previous speaker talked about addressing sort of the energy sector, which is a large source of carbon into the atmosphere. And here we have solar and we have wind, and we know that there's been enormous advances in terms of the economic viability of renewables, but that there's challenges associated with that. And one of the things that again, being better about modeling, and this is again where we come back to AI and begin to deploy AI against these prediction problems, is the better predictions you have on weather, the better you can manage your renewable resources. You can make adjustments in how you're distributing power. You can make adjustments in what sorts of other alternate power systems you're bringing online as you face an anticipated shortfall. And so there's a lot of discussion of various types of energy market methods of actually managing this, which makes prediction have a real value. So these are the types of things that you might imagine we're going to be thinking about in the future, is moving from that coal plant on the left to renewable plants on the right. And hopefully moving to an environment where we have a whole set of electrified transportation systems, not just cars, but perhaps aircraft, and perhaps ships. So there's discussion of the larger ships being moved across to nuclear power, which has a lot of large implications for shipping beyond the immediate carbon implications as well. Your ships can go faster, things like that. So I think I'll stop there. That's the end of my presentation. Stop my share. I hope I didn't run too far over here. And back to the moderator.
Bellingham, I think you were both perfectly on time. Thank you so much for both your talks on air and sustainability, specific to nuclear energy and also the environment. Now, I think we'll be going on to our joint Q&A session. So if you have any questions, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you both for very interesting lectures. Pleasure to meet you all. My name is Nate. This is more of a question for Dr. Broughel. Pardon if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly. So the nuclear waste aspect is a very interesting concept, especially Dr. Broughel with your kind of adoption of like a very latency period with like dealing with a nuclear waste as an after effect with this like shift to nuclear power. And so the DOE and the EPA, as an example, has spent billions of dollars on environmental cleanup sites over the past like couple of decades. And one of the fears that I think our group has is if we wait too long to clean up the nuclear waste through either current or future methods, it'll cause a number of environmental justice concerns. Cancer rates will spike in communities depending on where the placements of these power plants are. And so I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more as to why you chose your method of latency for dealing with nuclear waste rather than dealing with it now, especially as more big tech companies are simply going to sign more partnerships to develop more, for example, small modular reactor style power plants going forward in the future as we integrate Gen AI into literally everything that we do.
Thank you. This is a very thoughtful comment. So a couple of thoughts here. First of all, nuclear waste is not entirely waste. It is possible to reprocess nuclear waste and dramatically reduce its volume, but in the US, it is forbidden. Where is this not forbidden? It's in France. Okay, so France is reprocessing nuclear waste, reduces its volume, and now new technologies are being also developed to reduce not toxicity, this word escapes me, radioactivity. So in other words, at the moment, it might be prudent to change our regulatory environment with respect to nuclear waste, because the US was so worried about proliferation that reprocessing is banned. So unbanned reprocessing use existing nuclear waste on all the nuclear site as a fuel. You can use it again. And then you can start dealing with like this final step of where to store it. And you're absolutely right. There are environmental and energy justice concerns with respect to storing nuclear waste. And this is why Yucca Mountain, which was geologically a perfect repository, but it raised all sorts of environmental justice concerns, and that's why it failed. However, I wanted to note that communities that have nuclear usually love nuclear. So if you look at surveys, these people choose to be around nuclear. And this is one of the things that the US's DOE and other agencies are realizing, that it's much easier to build additional reactors on the sites of already existing nuclear plants, expanding them, rather than start putting reactors to absolutely new places. In other words, this a little bit alleviates your concerns that the people who live next to nuclear sites already love them. Again, it's not because I said it, it's the surveys. And with respect to cancer rates, if you look it up, coal power plants are much more dangerous than nuclear. So nuclear, it has fat tail risk. Of course, if there is a meltdown, that would be not great, but in the US, there wasn't one. And for cancer rates next to coal power plants are 3 to 4 times higher than nuclear, and nuclear is not distinguishable from any like ambient radioactivity. Basically, I will tell you a story. I went to a nuclear power plant in Austria that was never commissioned. It was built, and the locals were not asked whether you want a nuclear power plant. Then the referendum happened, and it was shut. It was never commissioned because people were so afraid of it. And Austria is known for being a very like pro green country, and now anti-nuclear too. So long story short, I came in from an international flight, and I volunteered to be scanned for radioactivity with the same device that usually nuclear engineers who went into the plant and other workers were scanned with. So I went from an international flight. During international flight, you catch a lot of radiation. Okay. I was so radioactive that if I was to work on this plant, I wouldn't be allowed inside the plant. I was so radioactive and I was pregnant too. My babies are fine, but we are getting a lot of radiation from so many other places, ambient radiation, international flights, that living next to a nuclear power plant, it is not a recipe for cancer.
I wanted to touch on the other side of Nathan's earlier question. And besides like the environmental concerns, I was thinking more of like the economic cost of like nuclear waste. So specifically, like if you look at like the historical context, right? Like the EPA has, like after the Clean Water Act got passed, we still spend billions of dollars today, every year, wasting taxpayer money, cleaning up like the chemical like stuff that we just dumped into our rivers. And I feel like if we don't take a regulate now approach versus wait and see, like, okay, we'll like figure out how to like store the nuclear waste like sometime later, tech companies are going to like build up a bunch of like power plants. They're gonna like, someone's gonna mess up somehow.
I got you. I have a clean
and have
solution
to
for you.
pay-
Ask them to put a decommissioning bond in place.
Excuse me?
That's it. You put a decommissioning bond in place. That's it. This is how all infrastructure is built. Solar is built like that. Wind is built like that. You put down, before you start the project, you're not allowed to build it unless you put down a decommissioning bond. What is that thing? You pay upfront for all the decommissioning. So, and storage and everything. So nuclear power plant. So before you start building nuclear, you put down a lot of money, and it's held in escrow account, and it accumulates interest for 80 years or for however long that place is operational. And then when it's time to decommission, there is that decommissioning bond. This money is sitting on the account, and you use it. I'm against using taxpayer money for this. So I'm with you on board, and there is a financial instrument for this. At the same time, I do not know of a Superfund site that is nuclear cleanup site. I know chemical sites, Syracuse, where I studied for grad school, we couldn't swim in the lake because there was chemical factory that used to be there. They didn't hear about decommissioning bonds in the beginning of the 20th century when all of this happened, but now we have a process for this. And nuclear shouldn't be like excluded from this. Like there is no way you build a nuclear power plant and there is like no financial responsibility for afterlife of this.
I'm wondering, so with these decommissioning bonds, if the cost goes over, is it the company's responsibility to pay for that as well, or?
Yeah, of course. Like we understand that nuclear waste is going to be, say, held on site for 60 to 100 years. Maybe if the reprocessing is now allowed, it will again be reused. So it's a positive cash flow that comes out from this nuclear waste. If it's not reused, this is the volume you're dealing with. And then at some point, the US has to find a final repository.
Gotcha. So basically, like, if everything does fall through, like, money is taken out from this, like, fund, repurposed. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
And we will know because now Finland and Sweden are also building such repositories. They're much smaller. So Finnish repository, as I mentioned, is 5,000 tons of waste. The US already has 80,000 tons of waste because we're sitting on, as I mentioned, on top of the largest nuclear fleet in the world. So it has to be a big repository. But there are also like new ideas of what to do with that nuclear waste. And here I'm gonna suggest a couple of like crazy ideas, but things are crazy. Like shoot it in space. Space launches are now becoming so cheap that maybe we can do that. We can throw it in the middle of tectonic plates. James will have different opinions about this, but it's all been investigated. What it does provide, it allows us to have firm baseload power that is clean. And again, if we're worried about climate change, if we're worried about our ocean currents, like I'm worried about ocean currents, like I will let nuclear waste sit for another 100 years and engineers figure out what to do with it. It's safe, it's there, it's been stored, it's being monitored. And at the same time, we won't sacrifice our growth, our quality of life, and will allow clean quality of life also for our children. In other words, I'm not worried about nuclear waste right now.
So even in
Sorry, I'm gonna have to intercept because we're running out of time. Just quickly, Dr. Bellingham, do you have any responses to some of these arguments that were made? And lastly, do either of you have advice for some of our participants who are, competing for submissions within the AI and sustainability track? And I think we'll wrap it up after those, but yes, thank you for your time.
Well, I guess I'll say, so a very interesting conversation on nuclear. That was, I learned a lot from that. And I have a lot, boy, I'd love to follow up with you afterwards, Anna. The other thing I'll just mention is that I think that finding ways to incentivize and increase transparency of a lot of these, a lot of the things that we know we want to have happen is critical. So I go to one of the big energy meetings, CERAWeek. I've been going to it since 2014, and when I used to give a climate talk there, I would talk to an empty room. And I remember one time I was with the president of Iceland, and one of the head people from DOE. Nobody was interested in it there. That's all changed in the last couple of years, and it's changed for two reasons. But the principal one really revolves around the requirement, an SEC requirement that companies actually report auditable information on carbon emissions. So there's these different levels, scope levels. And it turns out that shareholders care about this. And this was sort of partly a reaction to, greenwashing, everyone claiming that they were green. They were doing this, it was green, and, nobody knew whether it was really green or not. It probably wasn't usually. And so this was a bit of a response to that, but it had an enormous impact, so it's connected across to CEO salary, and CEO salary definitely drives the direction the company goes. And then the other thing that's happened is that an enormous amount of activity in the tech sector in this space as well. So I'll just say that, figuring out, so transparency can work wonders, let's just say, because people do care about this. But then figuring out how to incentivize, I would say prediction is enormously valuable to us as a society, but it's hard to find the business model that realizes that value for a company. And so that's something where a little bit of innovation, perhaps on the policy side, might actually drive a much better job of climate prediction, particularly in some of the particulars. So I think that would be enormously valuable to all of us, because right now we're really invested, particularly in the ocean parts of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bellingham. I think we'll wrap up today's session here. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks. Have fun.